Imagine you're in a line. Not just any line, it's a bread line. You've been there for hours. The cold is so intense that your hands can no longer feel your fingers. You hear the women in front of you crying, not from hunger, from despair, because they know that when they get to the front of the line, there will be no bread. Now imagine this repeating for days, for weeks, for months. Imagine seeing your children wasting away, seeing your husbands returning from the front with one arm missing, seeing the Tsar sitting in his palace, indifferent to everything. On March 8, 1917, the women of Petrograd decided they couldn't take it anymore. They took to the streets. They shouted for bread. They shouted for peace. They shouted for dignity. In 7 days, 300 years of dynasty evaporated. Welcome to 1917, the winter that brought down a Tsar. To understand what happened in Petrograd, you first need to understand Russia in 1917, an empire of 180 million people, ruled by a man who believed God had placed him there. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. 300 years of absolute power. Power he believed to be divine. But the empire Nicholas ruled was rotting from within. Russia was the most backward nation in Europe. Agriculture was medieval. Industry was precarious. Corruption was endemic. Famine was chronic. The Russian people lived in misery. Peasants who worked the land without owning it. Workers who lived in unsanitary slums. Women who worked 16 hours a day in textile factories. Children who died of hunger. And the Tsar? Nicholas II was a fragile man, indecisive, influenced by his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, and the monk Rasputin. He didn't understand the country he ruled. In his diary, he wrote about the weather, about walks, about his children's health, about the suffering of the people. Almost never. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. The idea was to strengthen patriotism, to unite the empire against the German enemy. But the war was a disaster. The Russian army was unprepared. Defeats piled up. Millions of soldiers died or were captured. The economy collapsed. The costs of the war drained the empire's resources. Food began to run out. The people began to wonder, why fight for a Tsar who doesn't care about us? Russia was about to explode, and the trigger would be the cruelest winter of all. Petrograd, 1917. The coldest winter in decades. The average temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the streets. The canals froze. Trains stopped. Supplies didn't arrive. And the food? Food was an obsession, a daily torture. The government had introduced rationing, but it didn't work. Bread lines stretched for miles. Women woke up at 3 in the morning to get a place. Many returned home empty-handed. Bread was the basis of the Russian diet. When it was lacking, hunger spread like a disease. People started eating horses, then cats, then dogs. Desperation doesn't discriminate. And the children? Children were the most affected. Malnutrition was widespread. Typhus and diphtheria spread. Hospitals were overcrowded. Medicines were scarce. The factory workers in Petrograd were at their breaking point. They worked in inhumane conditions, wages barely enough to buy bread, 12-hour workdays, and the war, always the war, consuming their husbands and children. The French historian Claude Anet, who was in Petrograd at the time, described the scene. The despair was palpable. The hunger wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was the feeling that the system had failed, that the Tsar didn't know, or worse, knew and didn't care. And then came March 8, 1917, International Women's Day. 9,000 textile workers left the factories. They went to the streets. They shouted, "Bread, peace, freedom." The women were not afraid. They were fed up with hunger, fed up with the war, fed up with seeing their children die. They marched through the avenues of Petrograd, defying the police, defying the cold, defying the Tsar. The next day, 90,000 workers were on strike. The factories stopped, the trams stopped, the schools closed, the city stopped. On March 10th, the strike spread throughout Petrograd. About 150,000 workers stopped working.
The streets were full. The crowd shouted, "Down with the autocracy! Down with the Tsar!" The Tsar was in Mogilev, at the military headquarters, 700 kilometers away. When he learned of the demonstrations, he sent a telegram, an order: suppress the revolt tomorrow. The troops were called in. Soldiers, many of them peasant recruits, were ordered to fire on the crowd. And they fired. But it wasn't enough. On March 11th, the police and the Cossacks tried to contain the crowd. There were clashes. Dozens of demonstrators died. But the people did not back down. The women, the working women, remained in the streets. They went to the front line. They placed themselves between the soldiers and the crowd. They shouted to the soldiers, "Don't shoot. You are our children, our husbands." It was the decisive moment. The troops sent to quell the revolt were mostly soldiers recruited from among the peasants and workers. They were not professional repressors. They were the people. The same people who were in the bread lines, the same people who were starving. On March 11th, the Pavlovsky Regiment mutinied. They shot their officers and joined the demonstrators. The example spread. On March 12th, 150,000 soldiers from Petrograd joined the revolution. They abandoned their posts, they surrendered their weapons, or they used them against the Tsar. The dual nature of that moment was clear. On one side, the officers, the commanders, the general staff, trying to save the regime.
On the other, the soldiers, the workers, the women, united by hunger and despair. On March 13th, the Tsar tried to return to Petrograd, but the train was blocked by the revolutionaries. He was trapped in Pskov, 300 kilometers from the capital, unable to return, unable to govern, unable to do anything. The man who ruled the world's largest empire was alone on a train, surrounded by generals who no longer respected him. On March 15, 1917, March 2 in the Julian calendar that Russia still used, Nicholas II signed his abdication. It was not a voluntary decision. It was an imposition. The general staff, the generals, his own advisors, all told him that the only way out was to abdicate, to save the empire, to save the dynasty, to save Russia. And what did he say in his diary? He wrote, "There is treachery, cowardice, and deceit everywhere." The greatest revolution in Russian history, the one that overthrew 300 years of absolute power, was reduced in the Tsar's diary to a personal complaint. Treachery, cowardice, deceit. He never understood that the real deceit was believing that God had placed him on the throne. Nicholas II abdicated in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael refused the throne. He knew there was nothing left to save. The Romanov dynasty had come to an end. What happened next? The revolutionaries formed a provisional government, but it was weak, divided between liberals and socialists, between those who wanted to continue the war and those who wanted peace. The real power was in the streets, in the Soviets, the councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers. They represented the will of the people, and they knew what they wanted: bread, peace, and land. The February Revolution was just the beginning. The October Revolution was yet to come. After the abdication, Nicholas II and his family were arrested. First at their residence in Tsarskoye Selo, then sent to Siberia, to Tobolsk, a city in the middle of nowhere. During his captivity, Nicholas read. He read Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev. For the first time in his life, he had time to think, to reflect. But according to historians, his mind did not change. He continued to believe that the Russian people were intrinsically noble and that corruption had foreign roots. He never understood what he had done wrong. In July 1918, the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in October, decided that Nicholas could no longer live. The Romanov family was executed in a house in Yekaterinburg. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, all dead. With the same cruelty he had ignored for years. 300 years of dynasty, 7 days to overthrow, less than a year to execute. History is sometimes merciless.
The winter of 1917 brought down a Tsar. But it wasn't the cold. It was hunger. It wasn't the snow. It was the lack of bread. It wasn't the war. It was indifference. What brought down Nicholas II was not a conspiracy. It wasn't an external enemy. It was the people. The people he never saw. The women he never heard. The soldiers he never respected. Today, St. Petersburg is a different city. There are no more bread lines. There is no more Tsar. There is a monument to those who died in the revolution. There is a museum that tells the story. But the question remains the same. How can a system that lasted 300 years fall in 7 days? Because hunger doesn't wait. Because despair has no patience. Because when the people decide they can't take it anymore, no army can stop them. The February Revolution wasn't planned. It wasn't led by a leader. It didn't follow a manual. It was spontaneous, organic, desperate. It was the revolt of those who had nothing left to lose, and that's why it worked. When Nicholas II abdicated, he said he was saving Russia. But the Russia he saved wasn't the Tsar's Russia. It was the people's Russia. And the people, at that moment, didn't want a Tsar anymore. They wanted bread, they wanted peace, they wanted dignity. Nicholas II never understood that.
And that's why he died as he lived, alone, misunderstood, and convinced that everyone was to blame but him. Petrograd, 1917. The winter that toppled a Tsar. In 7 days, 300 years of dynasty evaporated. It wasn't an invading army. It wasn't a planned revolution. It was the people. Hungry women, hesitant soldiers, desperate workers. They didn't want to overthrow the Tsar. They wanted bread. But when the Tsar didn't give them bread, they seized power. History is sometimes simple. A man in a palace, a crowd in a queue. One of them decides that the other no longer deserves to rule. Russia in 1917 is not just a historical event. It's a warning. When breadlines grow longer, empires shrink. When despair overcomes fear, revolutions are born. Today, there is no more Tsar. There is no more empire. There is only the question that remains. How long does it take for a weary people to decide that enough is enough? In Petrograd, it took 7 days, and history was never the same again. Winter passed, the snow melted, but the lesson remained. The people's patience has its limits, and when it runs out, no throne is high enough to protect itself.